Well, welcome. I'm so pleased that you came out this evening. It's great to see everybody here. My name is Ann Stahl, and I'm the acting dean of social sciences. I like to refer to myself as a pretend dean. I'm just playing at this. So I'm the dean of the social sciences, and this is a social science sponsored panel, and we're just so thrilled that you came out tonight to join us here. It's an honor and a privilege for us to be able to come together this evening on the territories of the Lekwungen peoples, and we respectfully acknowledge the ongoing relationships of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanich peoples to these lands. So we are grateful to our hosts. So welcome to Ideafest and to the Faculty of Social Sciences event, Beyond Plastic, Exploring the Issue of Waste in Canada. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I'm particularly interested in tonight's topic, which is a timely discussion and critical one as we move toward a better world. And the theme of Ideafest is ideas that can change everything, and I think we'll all agree that plastics is an issue that needs to be changed. I'm particularly interested in this as a kind of a wicked problem, one embedded in daily practice. And my research centers in West Africa, and I work in rural areas. And over the past 20, 25 years, I'm seeing a tremendous shift in consumption patterns. So things like fast foods, kind of street food, increasingly being packaged in plastic with loss of knowledge about the kinds of organic materials that were used to supply food. So I'm really interested to hear tonight about some of the solutions. Increasingly, people rely on plastic packets for their water, little sort of pint things of plastic bags which are not food safe. So these are really wicked problems, and a loss of knowledge of alternatives is increasingly happening. So again, very, very important issues. So our panelists tonight will examine the issue of plastics from a variety of angles. You'll hear from a geographer studying ways to stop ocean plastic pollution, a political scientist who examines the outsourcing of waste solutions, an economist who looks at incentives to reduce waste, and an environmental lawyer looking at law reform for plastics regulation. So the format of this evening, each of the speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 25 to 30 minutes for a question and answer period. So please, when we get to that point, raise your hand and somebody will find you with a mic. I also want to mention that this session is being webcast live. Oh my gosh, we're live on the jumbo cam. But the camera is focused on the panel and not on you. So you don't need to worry about your hair and things. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panel guests. To my right, we have Dr. Jutta Gutberlet, who's a professor in the Department of Geography and the director of the Community-Based Research Lab. Her research is action-oriented and focused on waste governance and food security. She'll talk tonight about some strategies for zero plastic waste. Dr. Will Greaves is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. He's an expert in international relations and global politics, and he'll be talking tonight about the politics of waste. Dr. Pascal Courty is a professor in the Department of Economics and an expert in industrial economics. He'll be talking tonight about how government incentives can be applied to change behavior and build incentives to reduce waste. Dr. Deborah Curran is an associate professor in both the Faculty of Law and the School of Environmental Studies. She's the executive director of the Environmental Law Clinic, and she'll discuss global directions in law reform for plastics regulation. So without further ado, we'll move on to our first speaker, Dr. Gutberlet. Join me in welcoming her.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Anne, and thank you all for coming here. I'm really pleased to see so many students, members from the community, and colleagues as well. Thank you very much. So I would like to speak today a little bit about some of the research I'm doing. I work a lot with informal recycling, with the waste pickers on a global scale, but specifically in Brazil, Argentina, Nicaragua, Tanzania, and Kenya. So my talk will be a little bit beyond Canada. And I have envisioned to speak specifically to the crisis, the plastic crisis, like the plastic predicament. I will give some backgrounds and then go right into the systems change, because we cannot continue as usual, business as usual. We need to radically shift. And then specifically give some insights from the research from the Global South and some final considerations. The work I'm doing right now is also in collaboration with an international expert panel on plastic waste to curb plastic leakage into the ocean. And so we have modeled several scenarios which could take us to near zero plastic leakage. And I will talk a little bit about these recent outcomes from that research as well. So if we continue as usual, we will see nearly 3 times more plastic leaking into our oceans. And those who are involved in beach cleanups and who have been at foreign beaches and have seen all the plastic which ends up at the beach, this is just the visual peak of the iceberg we're actually seeing of the plastic which is leaking into the ocean. So if we're falling short and current commitments do not add up to meaningful responses, we definitely need to shift. And we also came to the conclusion that any single strategy, any single solution strategy does not take us to the near zero plastic leakage. So improving recycling is not just the way. We need all suggested strategies to be implemented at the same time and everywhere. Of course, with certain time delays in terms of intensifying the strategies. So our panel has modeled these different scenarios, and the most ambitious measures will take us to a future with 81% plus or minus 8% less annual plastic leakage. So it's really very, very difficult to get to the completely zero plastic leakage. And that is, of course, due to the microplastics, the nanoplastics, those we cannot even see and capture out of the water. So currently we're seeing like 40% plastic production growth, and that is if we stay with business as usual, there will still be a 40% increase in plastic production and further investment in refineries as well. And it is also expected, if we follow that same direction, if we don't have a direction change, that there will still be an annual increase of 8.7% in ethylene production. So in Canada alone, plastic manufacturing sells $25 billion per year, and the plastic manufacturing industry employs 93,000 people across Canada. So it is a very powerful sector, and to find solutions, we need to work together. This figure here shows you the increase in plastic leakage into the ocean under business as usual, the black line, and the blue line with the current commitments in terms of reducing plastic straws, plastic bags, and some commitments which are already in place. But mostly our waste management system is still very much built on linearity. We're still seeing planned obsolescence and mass consumption, and single use and throw away is still out there, and we see it in supermarkets, in fast food outlets, etc. So nothing actually has changed, or not significantly changed. In Canada, and these figures here, they pretty much resemble the picture in other parts of the world as well. The package industry is the single largest contributor in plastic contribution, followed by the automotive and textile and electrical and electronic equipment sector. 90% of plastic in Canada is not recycled nor recovered. It goes to landfills or incineration. And one of the problems is that not every plastic can be recycled. There is so many different plastics in circulation that it's almost impossible to recycle them. There's 80,000 different chemicals in use currently, and alone in the food production, there is the different 933 different plastics, compositions of plastics are in use. So that makes it really very difficult to recirculate those materials. However, a zero plastic waste economy could help Canada save 500 million annual costs. It could create 42,000 direct jobs and indirect jobs, and it could prevent 1.82 megatons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So a significant contribution to our climate crisis as well. So we do need a systems change. And how does that systems change, how could it look like? Well, first of all, reduce the growth in plastic consumption, drastically reduce, avoid plastic packaging, and avoid buying plastic materials, seeking other alternatives. Substitute plastics with suitable alternative materials. Design products and packaging for repair and for reuse and for recycling, because so many new packagings are coming out onto the market and they are not recyclable. We also need, particularly in the Global South, expand waste collection and waste recycling, invest in mechanical recycling systems globally, and of course it also touches our individual level in terms of sustainable lifestyles and education. That's where we can do more. And research is also needed to find these and to promote further innovations, technology innovations, and educations and social innovations as well. That brings me to specific solutions and the specific role of the Global South in recovering materials, recovering recycling materials. In that expert panel, my expertise actually is specifically to look at what contribution can the informal waste pickers sector make in reducing plastic leakage into the ocean. And here I'm speaking about the waste pickers, the people who recover resources out of discardable. And these, of course, also includes the binners, who recover bins and bottles, who are here in Victoria. They call themselves diverters, which is a great name because that's what they are doing. They are diverting these materials from the waste stream into the circular economy. And very similar to the examples which I will be showcasing here from Brazil, where you see waste pickers organized in cooperatives or associations where they receive the recyclable material and separate it and sell it to the industry. There's different forms of organization. Some have more technologies, others less. But they do recover a significant amount of materials. Worldwide, there is 5 to 20 million informal waste pickers recovering materials. And actually, they are the strongest labor force in recovering materials. 60% of the global plastic is actually recovered by waste pickers all over the world. Yet most of them work under subhuman conditions, under very vulnerable, precarious conditions. Not all of them are organized, as I'm showing here in those cooperatives, where they have much better work and health conditions. But they also are facing the problem I mentioned earlier in terms of the diversification of the materials which are out there. Like here you see Pablo from Rio de Sul in the south of São Paulo, and he's showing a material which is a plastic bottle. It has an internal black layer. That bottle is not recyclable. Nobody wants it on the market. And you see all those big amount of compressed plastic bottles, the work which went into from that cooperative to separate the materials and to put them, to bring them into the circular economy, and there is no space for those materials. So we do need to regulate packaging. We do need regulate new materials. And also another sector of what the waste pickers are moving more and more into as well is recovering electronics and repairing electronics. And so they are also filling a niche on that side, reducing the waste of the plastic from these materials. So we need a systems change scenario. And here in this diagram, I don't know if you can actually read it, if it's readable in the back, but it kind of shows you each one of the sectors of contributing in terms of strategy to reduce plastic, be it by eliminating, by reusing, or finding new delivery models. We can reduce 30% through finding solutions in that area, or by substituting it with paper, coated paper, or yet other material, compostable materials. We can reduce 17% just by mechanical recycling, reinserting these materials into the circular economy. We can reduce 20%, and there's also the idea of using those plastics which are dirty, which are not recyclable, to use them as feedstock for plastic to plastic. And finally, we end up still with some mismanaged plastic, which is very difficult to avoid. In this figure here, which is one of the outcomes from our report from this panel, which is coordinated by the Pew Foundation and Systemic. And so we have organized and provide guidelines as to how to go step by step in terms of reducing plastics over the time until 2040 to really reach the breakthrough with eliminating plastics from our environment and the ocean. So it goes. It starts with reducing and reducing overpackaging, incentivize behavior change with reuse and refill, design current packaging for recycling, because now not everything is designed for recycling, and then also, of course, improve labeling, because people just don't know where to put which material. There is a lack of education about recycling as well. And this is something, for example, which diverters, spinners, waste pickers are picking up everywhere in terms of building bridges with the community and educating the community as to how to best separate, how to best recycle. And finally, my final bullet points here in terms of achieving that shift, they pass through, first of all, ban all superfluous uses of plastic, specifically the single-use plastic. There's so much unnecessary plastic wrapping happening nowadays. Wrapping suitcases to wrapping cucumbers, all this is completely unnecessary, and we're building our world on plastic. And then, of course, to regulate the plastic production. We need to regulate so that we create materials which are truly recyclable, guaranteeing 100% recyclability and efficient and non-contaminating. Extended producer responsibility and refund systems work very well. I think here in Victoria, in our community, we see that this is, on one hand, it gets all the bottles and the cans back into the industry, and it helps maintain livelihoods. It supports livelihoods. Furthermore, promote reuse and repair. There's initiatives like here on campus, we have the Repair Cafe, and in Fairfield there is another Repair Cafe, and this is happening all over the world. These are spaces where we think differently and where we can introduce new ideas, reducing the waste. And finally, of course, each one of us needs to shift our culture, our consumption, our ways of consuming and behavior to have a smaller consumption footprint. So rethinking what is actually necessary and introducing the concept of sufficiency. What do I actually need on a personal level can also make the difference. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. What a great turnout. My name is Will Greaves from the Political Science Department, and this is not the subject I normally speak on. So this is a fun opportunity for me to stretch my wings, so to speak, and speak to an issue which has grown in my mind as increasingly important, and I imagine is the same for many of you as well. I'm a political scientist, but I'm specifically an international relations scholar. So plastics and plastic waste, fall pretty far outside of what would normally be my ambit, and is not something that I have particularly focused on previously in my career. But last year was a very interesting year with respect to this issue because plastics and waste, the question of recyclables, the question of garbage, became an issue in Canadian foreign policy. It became an issue that touched on Canada's relationships with some rather significant countries in the world. So as many of you may be aware, in the first half of 2019, around a year ago, the president of the Philippines threatened Canada with war over more than 100 shipping containers of waste that had been exported to Manila Harbor in 2013 and 2014 and had been sitting at a pier rotting ever since. The waste was not, in fact, recycled goods. It was garbage. It had been incorrectly labeled and thus illegally exported to the Philippines. A Philippine court had ordered the waste to be returned from whence it came. There was no compliance with that order on the part of the private company that had shipped it there in the first place. And ultimately, this issue, having percolated within Philippine domestic politics, reached the desk of their rather bombastic president, who made it a foreign policy issue and invoked, I don't think there was a serious chance of war with the Philippines, don't get me wrong, but it says something about the nature of the issue, and it says something about the way in which plastic waste and waste more broadly has scaled up, and has scaled up not only, of course, physically in the world, but in terms of the way in which it impacts our politics, and issues which were previously considered domestic and perhaps even mundane are now more significant in terms of their global impacts and can have knock-on consequences for foreign policy and global politics in a way that was not previously the case. The Philippines instance was quite high profile, as I said, this bombastic invocation of a threat of war, but it was not unique. At around the exact same time, the government of Malaysia sent back more than 3,000 tons of waste and non-recyclable plastics to 13 wealthy countries, including Canada, for very similar reasons. In January of 2018, this issue also became one that attracted a great deal of attention internationally when China announced a ban on the importation of foreign plastic waste into that country, responding to domestic opinion within China that the world's soon-to-be largest economy, a country that has increased its status and prestige in the world very significantly, should, quite frankly, not be a landfill for wealthy, arrogant countries in other places. So it's with those events in mind that I turned my thoughts to this topic and have prepared just a few general comments for you today about what I see as some of the international and foreign policy ramifications of this issue. But I'd like to caveat my comments by saying that I've had to learn a very great deal about plastics and recycling in the brief period that I have been focusing on this question, that I have a great deal still to learn, but that it has been a very edifying process and somewhat horrifying process for me as well. So it'll come as no surprise to any of you, and Jutta has very kindly given us some of the data on this already. The Canadians produce a lot of plastic waste, an estimated 3.3 million tons per year at least. This waste includes almost 15 billion plastic bags every year and close to 57 million straws every day. And I had to do this mathematics several times on my phone. That works out to 20 billion 850 million approximately plastic bags that are entered into waste circulation every year in this country alone. It's a number that I think is difficult to wrap our heads around. As Jutta also noted, in Canada, a large proportion, a plurality of our plastic waste comes from single-use plastics and packaging as well. So we see a very significant impact on the total output from that sector and that limited scope of activities. But what was remarkable in doing some of this research is not just the sheer volume of waste that we produce, but rather the fact that Canada is, unfortunately, best in class. Canadians are the largest per capita producers of waste in the world. This amounts to approximately 720 kilos per capita of waste produced annually by every Canadian, which is approximately twice the amount of waste produced by our counterparts in Japan, and more than 10 times the amount of waste produced by inhabitants of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Our production of waste exceeds by between 7 and 10% the per capita waste output of our neighbors to the south, despite the fact that, of course, we are simply following many of the practices that they initiated, but which we have clearly taken to heart. So what are the conditions that explain Canada's waste problem? It's a very complex question, and I certainly don't suggest that I have comprehensive answers. But particularly for a country that possesses a national identity still largely connected to the natural environment, to the idea of being good environmental and ecological stewards, the disconnect to me is glaring. It's really quite shocking. And so I suggest that at least two factors have been key in explaining the rise of Canada's waste problem, and that there are several factors emerging in global and Canadian politics which make the status quo impossible to sustain. So the first factor that it seems to me likely is related to the emergence of this problem in Canada has to do with the large size, the geographic area of this country. The majority of Canadian waste goes to landfills in Canada, approximately 2.8 million tons of plastic waste alone every year, which is, the internet tells me, equivalent to the weight of approximately 24 CN towers. There are landfills across this country, from coast to coast to coast, but no one seems quite sure how many. However, government data suggests there are at least 2,400 medium and large size landfills, as I say, right across the country, obviously servicing every community in this country. Many of these are in close proximity to urban areas, Canada, of course, being a largely urbanized country, but these landfills typically exist out of sight of the general public, and thus, I would suggest, out of the public consciousness, the public mind as well. Because of our massive geographic size, we have the luxury of putting our waste in places that we don't have to see it, or, at least immediately, deal with it very much. And so Canadians have, I believe, remained largely unaware of the increasing scale of this problem, a reality that I think is in the process of changing, which is absolutely essential and which I very much hope this panel, in a modest way, helps to contribute to. A second factor, though, complementing the first one for the rise of this problem, is that some waste has actually been exported out of the country entirely, and this, of course, speaks to some of these global dimensions. Statistics Canada reports that in 2018, Canada exported nearly 50,000 tons of plastic waste, much of it to the United States, however. And reading that data triggered an interesting memory for me. I'm from Ontario originally. I was born and raised in Ottawa. And there was a story that emerged in the early 2000s when Michigan, the state of Michigan, had the temerity to stop accepting Toronto's garbage. And this was a major sensation in Southern Ontario. This was big, big news. And I was under the impression that that was still the case. However, upon further research, Michigan has changed its position and since 2016 has continued, or I should say, restored the importation of Canadian garbage, primarily from neighboring Ontario, into that state. This appears to be a response to basic economic incentives. Michigan is a hard done-by Rust Belt state that has still had trouble recovering from the Great Recession and that therefore has been willing to accept waste as a means of providing jobs, producing economic activity in that state. This, of course, produces many issues, but there has been a huge increase in the volume of solid waste from Canada back to Michigan. As one example of a destination in the United States, there was a 19% increase between 2016 and 2017 alone, which I interpret as Canadian businesses, in this case recycling and waste businesses, found a destination nearby willing to take their garbage and immediately threw as much garbage at them as we possibly could. However, as my kind of opening comment suggested, Canada also ships some proportion of its plastic waste outside of North America to be processed for recycling. And I think recycling should fairly be put in scare quotes there, since as the case of the Philippines suggests, sometimes what we're sending is not recyclable. Sometimes it's not recycled waste. It is garbage that we have either willingly or misleadingly labeled as recyclables in order to make them somebody else's problem. We seem to ship about 12% of our total plastic waste outside of North America, which of course contributes then to the production of a waste problem elsewhere in the world, while also producing environmental harms along the way, since this requires transoceanic shipping. It is environmentally intensive to send this environmentally damaging waste product away in the first place. In addition to the United States, destinations for Canadian waste include Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and Turkey, as well as, until January 2018, mainland China. There are several reasons, I believe, why this status quo is impossible to sustain. And I say impossible because even if Canadians wished it to be the case, even if we decided that this was not a problem that we actually were terribly focused on addressing, even if we didn't decide to address our own habits and consumption that was producing the problem, Canada is a small country in a big and increasingly, shall we say, messy world, and there are factors beyond our control which I believe will make it impossible for this status quo to be sustained. So to begin with, pollution is increasingly visible at home. Most, I think, high-profile plastic waste in Canada, particularly along Canada's coastlines, but also in freshwater. Not only does this present Canadians with the problem in the places where they live, work, and play, but it ruptures that deeply held belief that Canadians are actually good stewards of the environment and reminds us visually of the scale of the challenge that we face. No longer is plastic waste in the water a problem of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It is a problem of the Lower Mainland. It is a problem of Vancouver Island. It is a problem of the Great Lakes. It is a problem of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. Secondly, and this speaks to my own interest as an international relations scholar, this speaks to my interest as a scholar of Canadian foreign policy, but we are living through an extremely interesting and extremely tenuous period in global politics. The world is changing. The world is changing exceptionally rapidly. The world is changing perhaps more rapidly than it would if there were, shall we say, a different occupant of the most powerful office in the world located due south. But be that as it may, that's the reality, and that's the reality which is accelerating, quite frankly, the relative decline of the United States in the world, as well as those of its allies, and is contributing to a more rapid increase of other global actors, other countries, most specifically in the Asia-Pacific region, to roles of prominence and influence in the international order, not least of which in terms of setting the rules of the game. No longer will countries which have historically, and in the quite recent past, been considered poor, underdeveloped, and largely marginal to global politics, be willing to take the rules that are imposed upon them by a demographically decreasing proportion of wealthy Westerners. So this changing distribution of power internationally, including, very importantly, the rising affluence in the very economies, mostly in Asia, that have been receiving our exported non-North American garbage, are changing the conditions under which it will be possible for us to make our garbage somebody else's problem. Countries whose poverty previously led them to accept our waste products are, as my initial examples indicate, increasingly unwilling to do so, both because of its poor economic return for them and, in many cases, because of growing environmental movements domestically and demands from their own citizens that governments institute more robust environmental policies, of course, specifically in countries that have far larger populations and infinitesimally smaller land areas than our own. Countries that are, frankly, hard-pressed to find places to put all of the garbage that we would like to send them. This is where China's ban is such a critical moment. China's ban immediately transformed the global market for plastic waste and led to a very, very rapid increase in the imports of plastic waste in other Asian countries that had not instituted such a ban. The waste couldn't go to China anymore. Where else could we send it? There were some answers to that. And so Malaysia and Thailand demonstrate the most obvious correlation between increased imports of plastic waste and China's institution of a waste ban, with a significant increase in the overall amount of Canadian waste which they imported. Between the first and third quarters of 2018, Canadian data shows that Malaysia's imports of Canadian plastic waste almost doubled compared to the same period just a year previously. That is a rate of increase that is not sustainable. Not sustainable, not from our perspective, but from the Malaysian perspective. It will be just a matter of what I would expect to be a rather short period of time before that government responds to comparable pressures domestically as China has in order to no longer have to deal with this waste problem. But I think a third aspect here, a third issue which is underappreciated, which is a potentially significant factor in driving behavioral change for us, but also limiting the options that we have in terms of destinations to send this garbage, is the increasing environmental awareness in the United States itself. Recall, the United States is the largest destination for Canadian exports of plastic waste. And while I assure you I am aware that the United States has a very patchy record on environmentalism and that in many ways it is a dismal time in American environmental policymaking, there is a far greater degree of support within the American general public, one that is bipartisan, and indeed one that is in some cases more strongly reflected in rural areas of the United States that have leaned themselves more conservative, for environmental policies that avoid the dreaded C word. Climate change, of course. Climate change is a deeply divisive political issue in the United States. Climate policy is a morass in the United States. However, there is a far more robust popular basis for environmental regulations in the United States that are, as the president likes to say, about clean air and clean water. And so we see a far greater likelihood that American jurisdictions will in fact restrict and implement greater regulatory restrictions upon the capacity for Canadian waste to be exported there, which will further limit our options. So in the absence of export destinations, the choices facing Canada and Canadians will be quite simple. We can reduce how much of this waste we produce, or we can keep increasing volumes of it at home, making it a growing problem for our own land, our own waters, our own environmental quality, and deal with the problem that we have made. Or we can attempt to address the roots of the problem itself. Thank you all so much.
Good evening. So I'm going to give you a little economics view about the problem. So I'm going to talk exclusively about single item use. So it would be plastic bags, bottles, food wrapper, containers, cutlery, and so on and so forth. So these items have, depending on the item, takes between 20 to hundreds of years to decompose.
Can you cut some of the light so we can see the picture?
Oh, sorry, we're trying to webcast it, so that's why
Okay.
it's difficult, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the way I would like to think about it is that there is a virtuous cycle there in the consumption economy where you can go from production to sales to use, and then the key decision to stay in the virtuous cycle is how you discard of the single-use item. So either you can recycle it, or then it's going to either end up in a landfill or in litter. And that's what you want to decrease. And what I want to talk about today is how can we involve the public, the users, to minimize the amount that ends up in litter or in the landfill. And that's what I will mean by behavioral incentives. So there are incentives that will change the behavior of the consumers and hopefully will minimize the amount that ends up in litter or landfill. Obviously, there are other options, right? You could go for a straight ban, and if you can enforce it, that would be a solution to the problem. You could also try to tackle producers, and there are initiatives that do that. So they are color-coded in blue here, so advanced disposal fee or extended producer responsibility. You're trying to make the producers responsible by charging upfront a fee that would take care of a collection, and then the producers would be responsible for that. So I will leave that aside, and I will focus on the green items here. And it could be either a tax, and we're going to talk, you could tax the items you don't want. That's the economist solution to public bads, like goods that create bad consequences that society doesn't want. You could offer substitutes. You could increase awareness. You could have a system of, to increase recycling, you could have a system of deposit and refund where you pay people for bringing things back. So these are the type of responses I'm going to try to talk about. So if you want to think of behavior, you want to think about what makes us tick, what makes us choose what we do. And, well, if you follow the economist first, you're going to think about where we have our personal preferences, we have different attitudes toward the environment, and then there is the financial consequences of these acting upon these preferences. And the key issue is, can very, very small financial incentives have big consequences? That's going to be the issue at stake here. So can a small price or a small tax greatly reduce the amount of use or the amount that you keep in the virtuous cycle? And I'm going to illustrate that with two examples tonight. Obviously, there are other things you could do. You could have fines, you could have other financial rewards, and I'll briefly talk about that. Now, if you go a little bit beyond economics, you're going to have, you're going to want to understand that this decision is highly influenced by social norms. And so you want to understand the notion of conformity and what makes this movement tick and what makes, there's kind of a bandwagon and the attitude is not something that happens randomly and individually, right? And you also want to talk about awareness. How do you make people aware about what their actions, the impact of their actions on the environment? I'll briefly talk about that at the end. So let's talk about two systems. I'm going to talk first about deposit and refund. And this has been around for a long, long time for glass bottles and aluminum cans, and slowly it's been rolled out for plastic containers. And the idea is that you pay people 5 cents, 10 cents, 20 cents for returning these items. So the issue is, do these financial incentives have a big impact? So if you look at the redemption rates, you're going to find that there's a pretty high redemption rates from 60% up to 90% plus. But you can go beyond that. You can, if you look at the United States, different states have different regulation about deposit and refund, and they have introduced this regulation at different point in time. So here the table that you probably can't read very well, going to give you the states, and then you're going to have the year where they introduce a deposit and refund, and the amount. See, the amount are very tiny, 5 cents, 10 cents, a very small amount. And then these are the container that I included. And here you have the redemption rate. So what you're really interested in is to measure the behavioral response, and there are different ways you can do that. You can either look at before-after, so what happens to litter and before versus after, or you can look at across states. You can look at a state that has a deposit refund regulation and one that doesn't. And what you're going to do, one measure is going to be to either look at highway litter, because litter is systematically collected in the highway and things are counted and sorted, and then you have a pretty good idea of what ends up in the litter. Or you could do the same thing with coastal debris. So that's what the research has done. And what you observe is that there's a significant decrease in litter. So these very small financial incentives can decrease the amount of the items that are rewarded, that are paid for, by 40 to 80%, and about 10 to 40% of litter reduction. So the same numbers appear in Australia with similar study. And so you see a big impact. I mean, you pay a small amount of money and you get a massive reduction in, a massive increase in redemption and a massive reduction in litter. And interestingly, you pay for the bottle, you don't pay for the cap. So another way to look at it is to look at the ratio of bottle to caps in the states that have the incentive and those that don't. And you see, as you would expect, much more caps in the states that have the incentives relative to bottles if you compare that to the states that don't have the incentive. So you see, that's a proof that there is a response. You also find out that there is much less litter in the states where in the area with lower socioeconomic status. And this has to do with the whole idea of convenience. That recycling, basically, there's a feel-good effect, but there's also a time cost. And you know, we have to take that into account. And you would expect the time cost to be related to income. Not necessarily, but there's going to be a correlation. And the prediction would be that the people with lower time costs will either be more likely to recycle, or in those states where there are, like we were talking in the first part of the talk, where people, then it can be a profitable activity to collect these items because you can pay for it. So that's the first program. Now, a couple of caveats. Well, you need to be able to pay for the items, and to be able to pay for the items, you need these items to have some value in that virtuous circle. And that's going to work well for these items that have economic values. So it won't work well for plastic wrappers, for cutlery, or for very small items. You also need a stable refund price, because people have to start, collecting these items and systematically get that money back, if you believe that the financial incentives is really what is driving that system. And there is also a cost of setting up the whole collection and running the system for the government. So for these items that cannot be covered with this deposit system, the other option is to impose a tax. And here, let's take the example of plastic bags, because some countries went for the ban and other countries went for the tax option. So Ireland introduced a tax of 15 cents of a euro in 2002, and the UK introduced a 5p tax a bit later in 2015. In both cases, there was a dramatic decrease in the use of plastic bag, about 90%. In the UK, the top 7 supermarkets use 90% fewer plastic bags. In the Ireland, it's across all use of plastic bags. In Ireland, the plastic bags in litter went from 5%, it was 5% of total litter, to almost 0%. So we could put a tax on other disposable single-use item. As long as you can itemize and you can pay the consumers even a small amount, you can have a dramatic response. So let me turn to a couple more examples of behavioral incentives. So you could have, if you want to reduce plastic bottles, which seems to be like one of the growing concerns, people consume more and more plastic bottles, and they're turning to water, and they consume them in plastic bottles. So you could have a water filling station, and there was one piece of research that looked at the impact of having a water filling station in a state park in Australia, and they found a significant impact on litter in the park. You could have a pay-as-you-throw system. A community in Ontario introduced a system where you pay as a function of the size of your garbage, right? You have to buy the bags that are collected. And there was a significant response. Again, people started to be more careful, right? They possibly pack their garbage more carefully to put more items in the bag. But hopefully they also were more careful in the type of things they purchase and also in reusing. Some of the single-use items can be used multiple times. Before concluding, let me talk about the last, make a last point. I don't expect you to read that table, but let me talk you through the table. Here the issue is you want to know to what extent private values, so how much you care about the environment, social norms, to what extent peer pressure, and economic incentives influence your choice. And if you believe that table, it's a simple statistical analysis that look at your propensity to recycle bottles based on these different control variables that influence this dimension that I just talked about. You would see that each of them is about equal. So you want to try to change people's private values, and that's probably hard to do, but awareness programs try to do that, try to change people's preferences and attitude toward the environment. You want to work on social norms as well, and economic incentives also play a role. What's interesting about social norms, and that was a bit the catch of that table, is what matters is not so much whether you are concerned about your neighbors being nasty to you because you don't recycle. What really matters is how much you would like your neighbors to recycle, right? That's really what drives your attitude to recycle. It's not so much the pressure from your neighbors, it's more how much you would like your neighbors to recycle. So let me conclude by returning to be a bit positive and talk a bit an action plan. So I think the first thing you want to do is that all these items that have value, I mean, having more deposit system is probably a good way to go. Like that, you stay in that virtuous cycle. Those that don't have enough economic value, that it's too costly to set up this whole recycling chain, possibly trying a tax by a small amount and see what happens is a pretty good way to go. And then possibly you can work on other margins. Obviously, the ban is always a possibility, or you can work with producer responsibility. Thank you very much.
I'm going to start with my props. So this is what my kids got in their stock. They're old, but this is what my kids got in their stockings this year. And my proposal, a very minor proposal leaving here tonight if a bunch of people are from the University of Victoria, is that upon entry, the first day that you show up, whether you're a professor or a student or a staff person, you get a water bottle, a plate, a cup, and your cutlery. And then we simply don't offer those things anymore in any food service at all. And then the money that we save in terms of the amount of garbage that we're not exporting off the property, then that can go into other incentives for behavioral change and also for providing these kinds of things to guests who come and spend time with us because they won't necessarily have known to do that. So, thank you to my colleagues for setting up my law reform suggestions so very well, because they touch on all of what they have spoken about. And so in the next few minutes, I just want to speak about a few projects that we've worked on at the Environmental Law Center in the Faculty of Law, and also students in the School of Environmental Studies have also worked on these proposals. So the Environmental Law Center is a 25-year-old organization that offers a clinic course to law students where the students are able to work on community projects as their coursework. And so it's an opportunity for them to learn how to be lawyers in the context of actual community problems. And And in having worked in that organization for many years, we see trends in the kinds of issues that are brought to us from the community. So we don't go out and generate work. People come to us and ask us to help them solve problems. So for a long time, it was forestry issues, and then for about a decade, it was mining, and right now, in the last 3 years, it has been plastics off the scale. So it's amazing the sudden interest and the real the turn of attention to it, not from any massive calamity or from a specific environmental problem that's happened, but people's consciousness has just come into this notion that we're huge wasters and that 95% of the value of a piece of plastic is already lost, meaning the environmental impact when it's in your hand. So not producing it all is the response. So what I'd like to do is just in 2 minutes talk about our plastics work over the last 2 years, which is a fascinating national story, and then talk a little bit about plastics in law, how we think about plastics in law, and then finally, I just give you 5 reforms from a report that we at the Environmental Law Center did last fall. So the Environmental Law Center students provide about 4,000 hours of pro bono legal services to community organizations and First Nations around the province every year. And as I said, in 2017, we had the T. Buck Suzuki Foundation come to us and say, okay, no one is doing anything on plastics. So there were a few municipalities starting to make motions about the amount of litter and about the amount of plastic garbage in their waste streams, but there was virtually no provincial or federal response about plastics happening at all. So we did these 2 reports specifically about marine plastics, and in between those 2 reports being produced, we had 3 MPs from different parties come and have a meeting with us in the Environmental Law Center, and one of the MPs is now actually the Minister of Environment, and from that, Gord Johns, who's an NDP MP, put forward this motion M151 to the federal parliament, and it was passed unanimously. And what it says, the 2 areas of red, is that we need a national marine plastic strategy and that we need to look at and have a strategy for reducing and banning single-use plastics. So the federal government weighs in around 2017, and then from there, last fall, we did another report for the Kids for Plastic-Free Canada, and the photograph there is of them talking with our current Minister of Environment about the need for banning, in particular, single-use plastics and having a very comprehensive strategy around single-use plastic production and use here in British Columbia. So that leads me to today, where I just want to emphasize, and really our take-homes is, and what you've got a sense from our panel already, is that number 1, there are tons of financial levers that we can use, and we're not even scratching the surface. So we started as the first province in Canada to have a deposit refund system in the 1970s, and we haven't done a whole lot since. So there's been a little bit of movement around hazardous waste and other things, but we haven't capitalized on the success of that in a great way or moved that along very much. And there's tons of regulatory levers. So we have virtually done nothing to regulate what kind of plastics, how we use them, how we dispose of them, and how it is that we develop as a culture in terms of using those in our businesses and in our lives. So in 2018, the Union of BC Municipalities passed a resolution calling on the province to establish a single-use item reduction strategy. Mayors and councillors voted unanimously to introduce uniform province-wide business regulations in relation to disposable plastic packaging to substantially reduce the volume of disposable plastic packaging in local solid waste streams. The EU recently voted to ban single-use plastics, and hundreds of jurisdictions around the world have taken action. So it's now time for British Columbia to step up again and reestablish ourselves as leaders in this way. So just 4 very short comments about plastics and law. The first one is that all governments are responsible for dealing with plastic. which then makes it also more complex because they argue about who is responsible for doing what. So, the federal government is responsible for plastics in the ocean, arguably. The provincial government deals with recycling and standards for recycling. Municipalities deal with solid waste and with litter. So we really need a variety of different strategies and a comprehensive look where the various levels of government are talking with one another. The second point is that no jurisdiction is taking full responsibility. No jurisdiction can take full responsibility, and that's why we need to expect action at all levels of government. The third point is that plastics are legally complex. So plastics aren't a thing that were labeled in our Constitution Act of 1867. It's not like a jurisdiction has a particular approach to plastics. And so we see this complexity is changing because there are different kinds of plastics produced all the time. We have international trade and export requirements and considerations to take into account. We have local rules around waste. So just by pointing out the complexity and the number of municipalities that want to do plastic bag bans, I think it's quite evident that we need a more comprehensive approach and action from our provincial and federal governments to set some frameworks within which businesses and municipalities can act to get more comprehensive coverage. And then finally, as Jutta mentioned, we really need a shift to the circular economy. So if you produce it, you're responsible for it. So at the end of the day, it is that approach that's going to get choices being made in the market and by companies to not produce things that are hard to deal with at the end of the day in terms of waste. So we have no regulation of plastic, very few levers from a climate change or an oil production front. So companies produce all of these plastics, and then who really deals with them? It's municipalities at the end of the day, who have relatively few regulatory or financial levers at their fingertips to really deal with something that should be dealt with at the production end. So this shift to the circular economy, extended producer liability, and polluter pays, we need to return to those principles in our regulatory schemes. Okay, I would like to turn then to 5 different law reform recommendations, and for these I really need to thank my colleagues in the Environmental Law Center, Calvin Sanborn, our clinic director, and lawyer Aaron Gray, who have worked sequentially on these projects, as well as students Megan Partridge, Kieran Gill, and Alex McCardle, who put in hundreds of hours on researching these proposals. So the first one is to enact laws and policies regarding single-use plastic waste that follow a new waste management hierarchy that starts with avoid. So recycling green plastics cannot be an excuse for continued waste, and 5% of the damage already occurs when we have it in our hands, so the production of the oil to make the plastic in the first place. And as Matt Wilkins in Scientific American said, single-use plastic is an abuse of technology. And I'd like to turn us all to, and I encourage you to look into more carefully, the City of Vancouver's single-use item reduction strategy that names avoid as the first principle, and they're taking a long-term zero waste approach. The second law reform recommendation is to develop standards for compostable waste and ensure compostable plastics are actually compostable. And this actually, I'm sorry to say that this came on my radar a bit late. It was only about 4 months ago when my fantastic environmental studies students wrote sequentially a number of policy briefs about how a lot of the green waste from UVic is being diverted to the landfill to create tons of methane when it should be actually be going to compost facilities, but it's because we're all putting what are supposed to be compostable pieces of cutlery in that waste or in that green bin waste and contaminating it because there are no standards, and so you can say it's biodegradable and compostable, but there are no standards. And it's not compostable in a commercial sense, in a commercial composting operation, and so it becomes then waste. So really, a lot of what is labeled as compostable is not designed to break down, not only in commercial composting operations, but also in the environment, so it just remains as litter in the environment. And it's also not acceptable under our organic matter recycling regulation under Schedule 12, under the Environmental Management Act, which actually defines what compost is and what the materials going into compost can be. And, you know, cutlery is not in that list in Schedule 12. So we really have to develop provincial standards for compostable single-use items, ensuring that they're fully biodegradable, not only if littered into the environment, but then also if put in our green waste stream. And ensuring that these standards and certification for compostability are aligned with provincial composting infrastructure, meaning commercial, private composting infrastructure, and ensure that they're collected and managed through an extended producer responsibility program. We could also look to the EU compostable packaging standards, so they've done a lot more work than we have on this. And France has chosen to require that compostable products must be home compostable. So they're not relying on a commercial standard, which will compost more quickly and also more items. They're saying if it's not home compostable, then it isn't compostable. The third one is to establish a single-use item reduction strategy that includes a broad ban on certain products. So it should include a ban on at least 3 separate categories of products: single-use carrier plastic bags at the checkout, which perhaps gain the most attention, plastic straws, utensils, and plastic drink accessories, and polystyrene foam cups, and takeout containers that degrade into the environment in such a rapid rate that they're very, very difficult to deal with. And I point you to the EU directive of March of 2019. So this is sort of a European Union-wide, they're called directives, I'll say law. It's called the Reduction on the Impact of Certain Plastic Products on the Environment. And they will prohibit, that directive requires member states to prohibit some single-use items. It creates a bunch of different categories and requirements for each category, so standards and standards of use, and then recyclable and reduction requirements, and restricts single-use cutlery, plates, and straws, and then also creates some other extended producer liability requirements for, in particular, dealing with the waste management aspect of it. And the EU has estimated that bringing in this directive to full strength will avoid about 22 billion euros of environmental damage costs by 2030. So they've done some economic modeling on it. I'm going to move on to our next one, but I can give you lots of different examples of cities and states and municipalities that have either banned single-use items like plastic bags, like the state of California, or sorry, the city of San Francisco, or that require a small fee if you want one. So the state of California on a statewide basis. The next one is to reduce the volume and use of disposable food and beverage containers and encourage, support, and facilitate systems that help retailers provide convenient and practical reuse of takeout containers. So this is a hard area that we're now getting into public health and safety. And so the City of Vancouver, for example, in implementing its zero-use strategy or its zero-waste strategy, over time is really taking a good, or they're working in concert with public health in order to start talking about those things that don't allow us to take our home cup, for example, to somewhere and have it filled up. So there are certain places that don't allow that. So but these kinds of provincial-wide law reform would, for example, require certain businesses in certain categories or institutions, like the University of Victoria, to have reduction plans in place for disposable cups and disposable food containers, absolutely ban or prohibit the use of, or prohibit the default use of disposable cups for in-home beverages. So I'm going to just go off script because it is amazing to me. We are a captured audience here at UVic. The vast majority of the people who come here every day come here every day. We don't have a a fluid audience. Some of you are, but most of us come here every day. So like me, I can have all of these items in my office and simply reuse them. Students can have them in their backpack. So it's not too much of a culture shift to just not have them on offer and require us to bring them ourselves, or have a deposit system where I have to pay $1 if I want a cup, and then I get it back when I take the cup back to them. Other points under this particular area are require vendors to charge a fee for every disposable cup provided. And then finally, I'll just note that the City of Vancouver, although they have more jurisdiction than the rest of municipalities across the province, so we can't take their action in this area to indicate jurisdiction widely, but it's interesting in any case. In their zero waste strategy, they have now banned single-use foam containers as of January 1st. Straws will be banned as of April 22nd. Utensils as of April 22nd. Shopping bags January 1st, 2021. Cups the same day. And then, as I said, they are in conversation with public health around takeout containers. So, you know, it is very doable in that sense, and different jurisdictions are moving forward very rapidly. My final point, and it's already been made, is to increase the deposit required for beverage containers. So it's been a very long time since we increased our 5 and 10 cent beverage container deposits, and as was pointed out, it works. Unfortunately, it's only 71% province-wide in British Columbia, whereas places like Germany and the Netherlands that have a 50 cent or so, 40 to 50% deposit, the return rate is 90 to 95%. So there's a very clear, very simple, do the math kind of scenario where one very easy little regulation that we just already have in place and already have the infrastructure for doing that, just tweak it and we can get that more. So in conclusion, I can't underscore enough about how we need to make the link that reducing plastics is a major part of addressing climate change. So that point has already been made, but just to underscore it. And while, it's complex, let's start somewhere and change our consumer culture that within my lifetime has gone to a plastic economy and it wasn't before. And so we can certainly change to something different. Thank you.
Oops. Okay, thanks very much for that. Lots of food for thought. I was thinking about my scouting mess kit. How many of you still have a scouting mess kit? Yeah, that's what we can, yes. Anyway, so we have some microphones that are going to be floating around here. So questions, we'll start over here, of course, because the microphone's there, we're going to start here. And if if your question is for a specific individual, you might say that. Otherwise, yeah.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm curious who we're up against. In that so many of this made sense, and many of you touched on similar strategies, and we know many are already in place around the world. Recently, it came out that 1/4 of the tweets about climate change and skepticism has all been done by a bot. And so with respect to plastic reduction strategies and tactics, how much do we know about the lobbyists and the money going into keeping this system fed and going, as we sort of experienced when Victoria tried to ban the plastic bag and that didn't quite work out? Like, can anyone speak to what we know about, what else we're up against? The ones who don't want this to happen, not just the health authority piece was mentioned. I know it's been a struggle for a lot of individuals trying to take their own containers, and happy to hear Vancouver's trying to figure that out.
I'll only just speak to the Victoria piece. So, it was challenged by a producer organization. Unfortunately, I agree with the court decision. So the jurisdiction for municipalities to enact plastic bag ban bylaws has to be done under a business purpose. And the evidence was that Victoria did it for protection of the environment. But it's a very simple fix. The province, under Section 9 of the Community Charter, can just give authority to municipalities to ban plastic bags. I think, given the interest, we need to think much more broadly, because then you get a patchwork of plastic regulation and requirements across the province. And as we've seen with other kinds of things like the ability to ban cosmetic use of pesticides on residential properties, then you get a strange patchwork that is not coherent from a public policy perspective. So it would be better if it rested at the provincial scale to simply ban plastic bags or to deal with waste management in another way. The thing that I need to underscore is we are wide open in terms of regulatory jurisdiction to do a whole bunch of different things. We haven't even started scratching the surface, including from a municipal perspective where we could simply ban plastic in the dump and then require the industry to deal with that. There's a bunch of problems with that from a number of perspectives, but it's certainly, the CRD has the authority to say what goes into their dump, and they can take a much harder stance on plastics for sure. But Jutta, go ahead, you might have more.
No, I just wanted to reiterate that there is definitely the chemical industry which has a great interest in continuing with business as usual, generating so much profit for that sector. So they will probably find solutions how to circumvent that. Yeah.
Could I add one comment here?
Yep.
So I hesitate to say this in some ways because I recall with the Victoria decision, it was so interesting, it's the Plastic Bag Association of Canada. Like, it doesn't get much more blatant than that, kind of where you're coming from as far as your opposition is concerned. But I feel it's appropriate to note that in some ways this is also a struggle that we're having amongst ourselves. This is our problem. We're the consumers of these products and we're the users of these products. And if not ourselves, the people in this room, then our family members, our friends, our neighbors, our fellow citizens. Who here rejects the straw when it comes in the takeout bag? Who doesn't pick up a plastic fork if it's available? Who always takes their mug with them to Starbucks? We are complicit in this, I think, and I think it's important to reckon with that.
Okay. Do you want to read it?
This is a question for Pascal. Are you aware of incentives aimed at the recycling industry itself? And I think in particular the fact that glass does not currently have a recyclable content. We're expected to separate it out and then I don't know what happens to it. So are there industry incentives you're aware of to encourage the recycling process?
Not really, no. But thanks for the question. Food for thought.
I got a question here. So back here.
Question for Jutta. Some years ago, I saw a demonstration where this machine was used to recycle plastic into diesel fuel. Is that still an option? Is that viable?
Well, there is research is being done now into plastic to plastic, because there is already the technology exists to transform plastic into diesel. But it is actually not a very sustainable solution because so much energy went into producing the plastic and then we're just recycling it down into diesel, in a small fraction of diesel. So I don't see that as a solution.
So I got a question here, and then we have somebody in the back.
Sorry, this person's
Yes.
Thank you. A question to all of you. Are there any champions that you know of currently at the provincial or federal level in Canada that you feel are willing to take your recommendation, Deborah, with regard to jurisdiction forward?
Well, there was, as you saw, there was that motion, or that I had up on the screen. So motion M151 was put forward by an NDP MP, Gord Johns, and it was then picked up by the federal government, including the current Minister of Environment, who then brought it to the G7 summit and started talking about a global plastic strategy in terms of a marine plastic strategy. And then the federal government also announced that they would be looking into or had a policy direction towards looking at single-use plastics, in particular plastic bags. So that was in the fall of 2018. So we see, I mean, in my view, you know, I've said there has been an incredible amount of action or interest, not only from the community, but political uptake in the last 2 years. So the provincial government has also made an announcement in January that they would be addressing single-use plastic, certain single-use plastics, in particular plastic bags and cutlery and other things. And the announcement was a little bit vague in terms of the strategy will roll out in the very near future. I like to think that it was partially that conversation with about 10 to 18-year-olds that the Minister of Environment had, who convinced him that it was their future that the provincial government that was really responsible for, and they put some hard thinking into it. But I think that the sort of the momentum has been going for a couple of years, and we definitely see some action happening on that, on both the provincial and the federal front. You know, when I have the regulation on my screen, in terms of the actual text of the regulation and the fact that it's been enacted by our parliament, then I'll believe it when I see it, kind of thing. But there is definitely a momentum that we see that we haven't seen in other areas in terms of law reform and regulation in the last 2 years.
Question for Deborah. Why does Vancouver have more powers than other municipalities? What are its extra powers, and would it be good if other municipalities had those powers?
Yeah, so all of the municipalities and local governments in British Columbia are regulated through the Local Government Act and the Community Charter. And so there's regional districts and municipalities, but Vancouver, given its size and its complexity of governance, has its own provincial statute called the Community Charter. And they have some more general powers that allow them to have, in particular, more regulatory teeth for things like doing these kinds of regulations and just simply doing bans. The thing is, though, there is a lot that our municipalities could do under their business regulation power. So not under their protection of the natural environment power, but under business regulation, we have a lot of untapped potential there that municipalities haven't even started to use to deal with waste problems, and also what can go into businesses and be used by businesses. But again, citing the example of, for example, the ability to create watercourse or anti-pollution bylaws for watercourses, or to ban the use of cosmetic pesticides on residential properties. Those end up, if we pull pollution and other broad problems that cross municipal boundaries down to a municipal level, we end up with a patchwork that often doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when we have global waste streams and global production streams. And so I really encourage us to look to the provincial and the federal level to take action in this way.
My question's for Jutta mostly. Just essentially, what could or should we / the government do to support like the informal recycling sector, like the binners or waste pickers? Like I worked at the bottle depot and saw how much they were diverting, and now I work for the regional government and see the issues with like scavenging and things like that. So I've seen it kind of from both sides, and I'm just wondering what you think we should do to support them, since they are diverting so much waste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, increasing the bottle refund, I think that's a great way of increasing the livelihoods, improving the livelihoods, the return. But I think there is so much more to be done in terms of destigmatizing the activity as well, because binners and diverters and waste pickers as well, they are mostly seen as marginal and very stigmatized and excluded. So I think in terms of educating the community that they are actually doing a service by recovering these materials, I think that's an important step to do. And then really involve them as environmental ambassadors. You know, they can be the people who speaks to the community to educate and to show people how to separate better their materials and thus increasing the circularity of the materials as well. So I see there many different roles they can play in our communities.
Full disclosure, the group that I work with, Surf Riders, is a client of the Environmental Law Center. And so thank you for taking us on. I think that we're putting a lot of emphasis on the consumer and putting a lot of responsibility on the consumer, and I'm not sure we have that much of a choice as a consumer. It went from, and the economist knows this better than I, it's the economics of scale. A bamboo fork is about 9 cents for a bamboo fork for a restaurant to buy it. It's less than pennies for a restaurant to buy plastic forks. So, you know, I say to my daughter, you know, I hope you become a chemist and our grandchildren, that we produce better materials in the future at a fraction of the cost that it's costing us now, because plastic has got us whipped economically in terms of that cost. And if I want to buy hemp seeds from Manitoba, it comes in a foil and a plastic bag that in no way can be recycled because it's two different materials. And so we have to come up with better materials and better strategies. And then, you know, I'm holding in my hand here, and anybody can come by. This is the pellets that make our plastic products, and these are from a recycler in the Lower Mainland that turned them back into pellets from our recycling, and I got them from their parking lot. So recycling is kind of not working either. And ultimately, you know, we're going to build a plant in Prince George to make more pellets. It's going to be our first gas to pellet plant. So my question is, how are we going to, you know, confront this plastic economy at the industrial scale that it is really beating us with the numbers?
Thank you, Daniel. I think flowing from your comments on my class a few weeks ago, and also what Jutta said about the different qualities of plastic, and then the thing that makes me feel like an awful human every couple of weeks when I grind my coffee is my coffee comes in this totally not recyclable package because it's paper on the outside and it's shiny silver on the inside. And we can regulate that. You simply regulate the producers who do that, or require the coffee roasters in British Columbia not to use those kinds of bags. And we just don't do it at that. Like as I said, we're at ground, not even ground zero. We're at negative regulation from the perspective of saying, you know, we regulate pollution to a certain extent, but we don't say what, from a total life cycle analysis, what works for our economy, for our waste streams, for what we understand about ourselves. And so this is actually a really interesting and fascinating conversation that can go forward. What are the, you know, for the longest time, I thought there were 6 kind of plastics, because I looked on the bottom and it was a number 2, and I chucked it in my, you know, my recycle bin. And so we have to get back to, don't make the bottle with the black inside it that no one wants to use. We can only produce things that then can be dealt with, but also paying attention to, by saying we only want to produce things that can then be dealt with through recycling, we also then get rid of a whole bunch of stuff and retool the way in which we produce things at the front end so that we're not using plastics and we're not using as much of them.
So one over here, and then we'll come back here. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for answering my question ahead of time. So my question is about plastics and climate change. And so I know, so there are a lot of links between plastic pollution and climate change being made from fossil fuels. But I know there's also kind of like an interesting interaction, as I'm a microplastics researcher, and I notice sometimes on Twitter there will be a sort of wave of pushback from ecologists who study climate change and climate scientists against people who are sort of talking about plastic, because climate change is a much bigger issue, which I completely agree that it is. And so, like, I remember, for example, last year at one point, Catherine McKenna, their former environment minister, made a statement on Twitter saying that plastic pollution was the greatest issue facing the world's oceans, which is, like, patently not true. because we know climate change and ocean acidification are way worse. So I guess my question is, how do we frame plastic pollution and dealing with it in light of climate change? And is there a danger in that? How do we keep it in context? Because of this, we've managed to keep it relatively bipartisan. If we start talking about it in terms of climate, does it then become a partisan issue? How do we kind of parse that out while also not putting all of our money and our regulations into plastic and forgetting about the climate, and so basically cleaning up the oceans while everything still dies?
Simple question.
Well, I think there is no competition as to what is the more wickedest problem. I think both are as wicked. And you research microplastics, so you know the extent of the issue with microplastics and where they are produced and how little we know about them. For example, microplastics in the global north, most of the microplastics comes actually from the tire rub-off. So each time we are using our car, microplastics gets into the groundwater or gets washed into the drainage and then ends up in the groundwater and rivers and oceans. And the same with nanoplastics as well, which is even less studied by now. All the fibers, synthetic fibers, which are in use right now in our clothing, in the textile industries, and which just by walking around in those clothing and the fibers get shed off and we are washing those clothing, the microfibers and nanofibers, they get into the water and end up in our ocean. So I think we already have a tremendously huge problem. Maybe we're not yet aware about it. Because these nanoplastics and microplastics, they also enter our food chain and they affect our health, which is still not studied deep enough. We're just scratching the surface of knowing what are the impacts, the health impacts.
So thank you.
Can I respond to that as well?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I have to respond as a political scientist. I'm contractually bound. The 2019 federal election was really fascinating, right? For a number of different reasons, many of which are not directly relevant to today. But it was an election which, by all rights, the Conservative Party of Canada should probably have won, right? Given the circumstances, particularly that led very immediately to Election Day, a number of weaknesses on the part of the governing Liberal Party and Prime Minister Trudeau. It was their election for the taking, and it's, I think, generally regarded by Canadian political scientists that the Conservative Party lost the 2019 election because of their position on climate change, that staunch refusal to engage with the issue in good faith or seriously alienated critical voting blocs in critical parts of the country and was simply enough to deprive them of the votes that they needed in the places that they needed them, and allowed in fact, I believe the weakest government by popular vote to ever be formed, or not maybe ever, but certainly in recent times, federally. So there's a remarkable kind of political salience and lesson to be learned from the 2019 election, and it very much remains to be seen whether or not the Conservative Party will learn it as they go through their leadership race. It is not so far very encouraging that the leading candidates are going to alter their party line on climate change, that they're going to embrace the Conservative tradition of engaging on climate change more robustly that exists certainly in the Progressive Conservative, Brian Mulroney wing of the party. But what I was really quite fascinated to see, again, in the context of researching for my comments this evening, was the response by the deputy leader of the Conservative Party, Leona Asleave, after the federal government announced their intention to impose the single-use plastics ban next year, was to immediately frame it in very similar terms to how the Conservatives have framed climate change, which is to say this is a liberal imposition on hardworking Canadians. It's a way for the government to regulate more people to no good effect. And I very loosely paraphrase here, you know, the government has declared war on people because of the carbon tax, and now they're declaring war on plastics too. And it was an immediate kind of 0 to 100 treatment of the plastic ban as something that no quarter shall be given, no compromise shall be reached, and the Conservative Party will stand against this issue as well. And I was very surprised to see that. I was surprised to see that because it strikes me as bad politics. It's not my party, but it seems like a bad political tactic for them to pursue. And it also is one that suggests a deeper partisan rejection of all things environmental amongst Canadian Conservatives at the party level, which is not borne out by the actual feelings of Canadian Conservative voters who have decidedly mixed feelings to negative feelings about climate change, but as I alluded earlier, are often, by virtue of being more rural, often occupying certain types of professions which are invested in the quality of environmental systems, have a rich tradition of conservative environmentalism to draw from, and should be very wary of allowing themselves to be painted as not just the anti-climate change party, the anti-carbon pricing party, but the anti-environmental party writ large. And we'll see where their line goes in terms of the plastics ban. But I think that will be a really, really telling indicator, on the one hand, of whether or not they simply see environmental issues as being urban lefty issues, to be blunt. And in the same vein, whether or not that party is more interested in actually forming government in the foreseeable future than they are in pandering to an increasingly small, aging, conservative rump voter base. And it's a question that doesn't have an answer at the moment. It's quite literally, I think, what that party is, part of the process that party is going through.
So we have a question here, then a question in the back. He's been waiting for quite a bit, and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
This question is also for Dr. Greaves about your somewhat embarrassing statistic about Canada being the highest per capita producer of waste. Is that all household waste, or did that include, say, institutional and industrial waste as well?
It is not just household. It is absolutely all three of those categories, yes. So it's the per capita numbers when you include the responsibility of industrial producers as well.
Hey, so my question is kind of about the cleanup of plastic waste, in part the informal cleanup, but also by anyone, really. It seems to me there has to be some economic incentive for that to really take off, and it happens with binners, with the informal cleaners, in part with bottles. But there's not much of an incentive for plastic wrappers, plastic bags. And I'm wondering, can there be an incentive given? Can the economics be altered that they are turned into something which is valuable to produce? So there's some motivation, there's some higher monetary amount given to people who do pick it up. But I know you mentioned that it could be plastic to plastic recycling. Can that be valuable enough to incentivize people to clean it up? And just to quickly flow from that into something else, very, very connected, what's our end goal? Is our end goal to have plastic floating around forever in terms of recycling plastic to plastic? Because it seems to me that as long as we have plastic products, there's going to be continual microplastic release. So do we have an end game here, like of a society that doesn't use plastic at all? Or are we going to forever keep using plastic, ideally recycling? Thanks.
These are difficult questions. I mean, just I researched a little bit the cost-benefit analysis of recycling, and very little has been written that is rigorous. So it's not clear once you include all the cost of setting up the systems, of collecting the items, and processing them and putting them back in the system. Probably for some items, you do well if they are very high value, like aluminum or others. But for plastic, I couldn't find any rigorous cost-benefit analysis that include all the considerations. And your other question is it's a very big picture question. It's hard to respond. Plastic provide a lot of convenience. That's why they've done so well. I think, to go back to a comment earlier, I think probably some studies will have to be made. What's the impact of preventing plastic bags on retail? Maybe there is no impact, maybe there is some impact, but it's clear that all these plastic items, they're facilitators, they're like parking lots and long opening hours. They increase business. And once we hammer on this source of convenience, it might have an economic impact on retail, and maybe that's where the pushback going to be. So just a couple of ideas.
Yeah, I could very briefly speak to the plastic to plastic, which you mentioned as a solution, which is still a technology being tested. But I'm also not very fond of that technology, because I think it does not change the business as usual, because it does not incentivize us to reduce. And I think we should first of all reduce. And then also thinking that that technology, it's very expensive. And for example, if a country in the global south would opt for that technology, they would probably want to make the best out of it, which means then not recycle all the other materials, but everything would go as feedstock into that technology. So I'm actually opposed to that, as well as to what is called waste to energy, which recovers some level, a small level of energy from our waste by incinerating the waste.
Hi, I'm wondering if the panel, by any remote chance, knows of any research that is being conducted on the effect of, for example, nanoplastic particles that are blown around in the air, the effect upon the soil and all the processes there by degraded plastic particles, and whether that could be used to bring in higher levels of government, given that so much has been focused on the patchwork of having the municipal governments address this, and whether, if there is any such research that indicates health problems, if there is any way of producing some sort of pressure movement from anybody to actually deal with this. I have my doubts that this is a hopeful case at the moment, but I'd be pleased to hear.
Well, this is also a very recent topic. Last year I went to a conference on waste management, and there was a paper presented on nanoplastics, the uptake of nanoplastics into the food chain. But it was like one of the first papers I have seen. And in literature, I do know that microplastics, if they are uptaken through food, they can impact our endocrine system, which then can make us more vulnerable for cancers, etc. But this is very recent research. I don't know if at UVic somebody is actually looking into that issue.
Hi, I think here in this room there is little youth. Do you think it is important, and how would you bring awareness in the community to focusing more on the youth aspect on this plastic issue?
Given the leadership the youth have been showing the legislature over the last couple of months, I don't think that there's anything that we need to do. I think what we need to do is be very supportive. So I just point to our clients, Kids for a Plastic-Free Canada, who have put forward that law reform proposal to the provincial government, who are now acting on law reform in the plastic area. And so this is certainly something that, in my view, youth are much more passionate about, in the sense of you have a sense that it is your world that is going to be shrink-wrapped at some point in time, and that's not the world that you want to live in. Whereas folks of my generation and older are just used to being able to go out and have a plastic fork, the convenience of that. So I would encourage you to either connect with organizations like Kids for a Plastic-Free Canada, and or integrate that into other organizations that you're working with. So there has not been, there is now increasingly, as of a year ago and forward, more focus by environmental organizations on plastics, but sort of prior to 2018, there was very little sustained activity. And now we see not only activity by nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations, but also levels of government. So we have a really large policy window, and so not only do we have the social license to go ahead, I think governments feel that very much, but we also very much have a receptivity to a certain extent at all levels of government. So I'm happy to chat with you later about other organizations that are involved in doing things that are having an impact.
And if I could add one thing to that as well. So part of my research, I have looked at and continue to have a project I'm running looking at youth climate activism. So I have an interest in young people's engagement on environmental issues, climate change specifically, but obviously the nature of our environmental crises extends far beyond that. And I've also watched the solidarity protests and actions in the last number of weeks very closely. And frankly, I'm not that old myself, I don't think. But it's very sobering when you look at, the literature on environmental issues, plastics, but, across the spectrum of challenges. And of course, there's new information. Of course, we know things that we didn't used to know. But in many cases, the fundamental nature of the problem has been well known for decades, for my lifetime, right? In the case of climate change, the Toronto Conference in 1988, I was 4 years old. So the idea that, we only know now, and now government's going to respond, and now is I think, actually a form of gaslighting. I think that's a way of seeking to suck the radicalism out of young people. And I think that on environmental questions, political change will be driven by the radicalization of young people. And I think we need to lean in and embrace and encourage through all the means at our disposal, young people's direct action engagement on forcing government to respond more aggressively to a whole host of environmental issues, not least of which is climate change. But I would love to see the kinds of tactics that we've seen young people pick up on the climate fight and employ them in other domains of environmental policy making, up to and including plastics.
Maybe they could start voting too.
Exactly. Yes.
Sure, but they're only ever able to vote for the options on the ballot, and sometimes that's not going to get the job done. So voting is critical. It cannot be the end of the story. People have been voting for a long time, and here we are.
This is a question for Deborah. It's a technical one. You refer to microplastics, nanoplastics, and nurdles. What are nurdles?
Oh, you know what? Daniel can tell you what nurdles are way better than I can. So they're, he's got some over there. So they are the small component pieces of plastic from which plastic things that we use are made. So they are the small pieces that are shipped around the world that then plastic manufacturers take in to then mold their own things, plastic bags, benches, whatever they happen to be, out of them. But Daniel he can put your hand up again, Daniel. He has some examples that he collected from somewhere that those samples were going to fall into the Fraser River and be eaten by our salmon. So he gathered them so that they would not be. And he can talk to you much more in depth about nurdles than I can.
Can you define nanoplastics and microplastics?
I can't. No, I'm just a lawyer. So there is some. If I actually had to litigate on this, I would be able to define it. But we have someone doing their PhD back here, and we have Daniel over here. So I would really encourage you to chat with those folks, or someone give them a microphone and they can.
I think we're going to have an entire seminar on all these things. There's so much knowledge in this. Over here, please.
We see in the news every now and then various schemes, booms, and so on to recover plastics from the ocean. Do any of you think there's any possibility that these schemes will ever make a significant reduction in ocean plastics?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, this is if we want to deal with it internationally, like the entire ocean, we need to go to the source of plastic, which is in other places of the world. So we can't have a domestic strategy, we have to lead an international strategy. And so this is where we get to not just being able to use internal levers, but it's very much an international conversation, because comparatively, there's not a whole lot of plastic bags coming out of the Fraser River into the Pacific Ocean and causing problems. I'm not going to make any qualitative assessments about whether I think there's any hope or not.
The one thing that I found interesting, and one word that you mentioned, was the word avoid. And I've never seen that before. So I said to myself, the problem seems to be pushed down to the federal level, the provincial, the municipal, and then to us individually. But if you go back to the word avoid, if you go back to the manufacturers who make single-use bags, then we don't have to deal with all of this. And I find it, not ironic, what's the word? I find it sad that there's so many municipalities dealing with this issue in terms of what we do with these single bags. I read a couple years ago that Rwanda, a third world country, has eliminated single-use bags, just like that. It's done. And I said, we have so much regulation that it just boggles us to the point where it almost ties our hands, that we can't proceed. So the question I'm going to ask you is, can we go to the producers and somehow tell them to stop?
The short answer is absolutely yes. So when we categorize different kinds of materials in our environment, either under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act or under the Provincial Environmental Management Act and the 46 regulations that come under it. So we regulate the way in which we can use products in our environment, whether it's putting fertilizer on soil and the impacts on groundwater, whether it is the kinds of pharmaceutical chemicals that we allow into Canada from elsewhere. So these are all different elements of manufactured processes that we regulate. We also regulate some manufacturing processes. And so we have a wide range of ability at different scales to say the kinds of materials that we permit to be used in our society for waste management and for other reasons. So that's number one. And then what businesses are allowed to use in their actual business practices are also another layer that we can very much get at. So as I've sort of underscored, when I say we have very broad regulatory jurisdiction to address these questions from a manufacturing perspective, from a waste management perspective, what I mean is there's a lot that we can do already, and we just haven't taken that step as a government. So sure, we have lots of regulation, but we actually don't have a whole lot of regulation around plastic. So we haven't treated it as a topic that needs to be addressed very specifically in the way that we live our lives, or the kinds of products that we're allowed. So, in the question both about youth and about whether or not we can back things up, I want us to focus on, this isn't just about plastics when we talk about extended producer liability. Extended producer liability should, yes, be for plastic products, so the producers are responsible for the end of the day impact. And if they are responsible for the end of the day impact, they will change their choices about the kinds of products that they produce in the first place, because there's a lot of plastics that are very difficult to deal with. But it's about everything. It's about car manufacturing. It is about all of the different kinds of choices about the things that we produce in our society that aren't easily dealt with. If we make the producer responsible for those, it's not only they're going to change their choices, but it will also cause us to change our choices, because certain things that are persistent in the environment or not able to be dealt with will be much more expensive. And that will very rapidly send a signal to us about the actual environmental impacts of our consumer choices and our manufacturing choices that we don't experience really right now. And we don't experience it because we still treat the environment as dilution is the solution to pollution. So any waste that goes out into the water or anything put in landfills, depending on whether they're hazardous or not, there is very much a sense of vast Canada can still deal with or can still dilute the waste that we have for it. And that is very much, if you look through our laws, we're still at kind of a 1960s, 1970s level of actually treating pollution and waste.
So I'm mindful that we have about 5 minutes. We're going to take one question back here. We've been waiting quite a while. We'll take a question here and then a question here. And then I think we're going to have to... I think we may just do one back there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
How do you intend to increase communication between society and industry? Because currently, I went to Saskatchewan about half a year ago, and they're just geared towards building and building and building. And not that it's bad, but again, they're not doing things like recycling and whatnot as well as we're doing here. And relative to here, again, some people, like if you meet a homeless gentleman downtown, he's going to hold on to that cup because that's what he has. And understandably, you may want him to recycle many of the materials that he's using, but that very well may be all he has. How do you increase the communication between society and industry?
You've asked a stumper.
Yeah. Is it a communication issue, I guess, is my response. I'm not sure that it's a communication issue except in a very, very general interpretation of communication. I think price signals are a means of communicating, right? Regulation is a means of communicating. I don't know that it's an issue of communication per se between industry and society. It's a question of interests and the question of actors responding to those interests according to the way in which they've been incentivized at the moment is my attempt to answer that question.
A question over here.
Thanks. Yeah, I would like to thank the panel because I came here tonight. I sit on a CRD committee. It's called the Solid Waste Advisory Committee. Don't know if you're aware about it. But what I would like to challenge all of you to go away, if you do know the answer to this question, that's great. But do you know where your garbage goes? If you live in the CRD area, there are 13 different units or municipalities, whatever you want to call them, and there are 13 different ways of looking after what we dispose of. There's no away, but it goes to a lot of different aways depending where you are. And in some places in this region, yes, we have some kind of garbage disposal and solid waste management at the municipal level, but that's only 6 of the 13 municipalities that have something like that. I don't know how aware people are, but I've learned a lot about waste management, and management of the plastics is just one portion that needs to be done.
For a number of years now, as citizens, we've been taking our excess single-use plastic bags to grocery stores, community grocery stores, and we place them in a bin that's titled plastic bags. What happens to those plastic bags?
Actually, I can give that answer because last year I had a field trip with a group of students to Heartland, and we asked them. It all is shipped to Vancouver mainland and goes into the incinerator. The the soft plastic is incinerated.
That's kind of a depressing note to end on. Yeah, so I think
I'm going to rave around my cutlery just because I want a happy note.
Maybe.
Oh, go ahead.
Just one more minute, because we were talking so much about the single-use plastic bag and also the cutlery, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more single-use plastic in use. Like our toilet paper comes in plastic bag. Everything is wrapped in plastic bag and needs to be substituted. We need to look for alternatives. And I so much agree with what Deb was saying in terms of we need the regulation. If we put out new materials, if new materials are designed, we need to know where they end up, whether there is a circularity. And if not, it should not be put on the market. It's simple as that. And it needs to be internationally, because if only Canada spearheads that and the rest of the world continues producing all these materials, they will end up in the ocean and on our beach
Maybe Ismo. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure this could go on till 10 o'clock, but we have the room until 9. So I want to thank, please join me in offering a warm thanks to all of our speakers. We also want to thank our communications officer, Ann McLaren, for all the event planning and help with tonight's panel, and our assistant over here with all the microphone help, so thanks a lot. And we certainly want to thank you for coming out and spending part of your evening with us. Don't forget there's surveys. If you fill out the survey, there's a chance to win an iPad, but I feel kind of badly about this because it's probably wrapped in plastic. We'll try to be sure that it's... So have a safe evening as you head home. Thanks a lot.